So I'm not telling you that it's some secret code and no one can read it. I'm not telling you that. But I am saying, as far as punctuation goes and spaces between words and all that kind of stuff, it's not obvious. So those things can make a difference.
So it would have been obvious to the people of the time, though?
Yeah,
that seems
because they're just used to it.
It's still really hard, though, because if I wrote a letter and didn't use any capitalization or anything...
I'm sorry I didn't do this. I actually did that in English, and I just smashed it all together. You can read it just fine. Okay, but it's because you know.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, you're in your own historical context.
Right.
Everything is in context.
But it does make it more complicated.
Sure, it's
hard.
I
mean, you still have to, work it out.
Yeah. It's harder, but if that's all you ever knew,
right,
it would at least be more natural.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody ever came along and that was all you ever knew, and somebody started putting spaces in words, you might go, oh, that's a little easier. But if it's all you know, then it's not as bad.
Right.
So here's a fairly common verse. What does it say? All right. This is always how it's presented. Pretty much. Not always, but pretty much. So let's move the commas and the quotes and do it like this.
Oh.
Does that change it?
Yeah.
All I did was move the comma. Now it changes it.
Oh, yeah.
Is that, what do you think? Is that right, or is it right the other way?
Well, so the way we think is right the other way.
So let's think about that. If somebody's out in the wilderness where no one is, who's listening? Who's going to prepare the way of the Lord? But if you're crying where people can hear you crying out, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, they might go out there and do it. And that's what the Qumran community thought it meant. That's why they went out into the wilderness and built their community to prepare the way for the Lord. Also, if you bring in the cultural context, in ancient times, kings that were going on a journey would send a crew out ahead of them to prepare the way so it wouldn't be all messed up, clearing rocks and making sure there were no bandits or whatever else. They would go out into the wilderness to prepare the way for their Lord.
The thing about that, too, is so often when we're talking about the presence of God, it's in the wilderness. Or when we're talking about where we meet with God, it's in those wilderness places.
Right.
So that, in that sense...
If you bring that in from last time, yeah, even that sense goes to go out into the wilderness to prepare the way. Now, to go along with, to enhance this... Oh, well, we'll get to that. You keep reading. That's the next words. Make a straight highway in the desert. Okay? So let's put it all together like this, and that's probably the better rendering. We haven't changed any word. All I did was move the punctuation. Well, I did move the words around, but that's not Hebrew anyway, that's English. So this is, I think, a better understanding. Plus, what is this one really talking about? Especially if we make John the one that was being talked about, predicted, and then he says he says he's this one. He's talking about your heart. Prepare the way of the Lord. Why is he saying this and saying that he's the one saying this and doing baptism? What's that got to do with preparing a way? He's not moving any rocks. He's not clearing any paths. He's telling you, prepare the way of the Lord, and this is how. Immerse yourself. Change your heart. That's what he's saying. That's what I think he's saying. To put it all together. Anyway, once again, the point is, these little things make a big difference in how we read it. As soon as you can, let me know. Okay. Well, actually, I'll just go into the geographical context. Now, that's not something we ever think about, but after last time, now we are going to, aren't we? Where are we? That's going to make a difference. Now we know. That's going to make a difference in how we interpret stuff. The whole thing about Gergesa, which I guess you'll have to get filled in on. But now we know, I think, that really impacts what is he doing there and why there. He's talking about he's ministering to the people who've been expelled, and while he's there, he's doing some expelling. It even goes together, and you'll get that when you get to that point. Translation styles. Now, there's different approaches when a person or a committee gets together and say, okay, we're going to make a new translation. How are we going to do it? They have what they call literal equivalency, which means we're going to take every word and try and get one other word in our language to exactly pair as closely as possible. We just want the total number count of words to be the same. Okay? So, we'll look at some examples later. So you just want to say, if it says voice of one crying, then I want to construct a sentence in my language that's whatever the word for voice is, whatever the word for of is. See what I'm saying? That's what they call literal equivalency. Even if it doesn't make as good of sense in our language, we're still going to choose that approach. That's an approach. Fortunately for us, and we'll see in later lessons, really fortunately for us, the ancients only had that way. They thought that was the way to do it. So luckily, when we read Greek Old Testament and are familiar with Hebrew culture and the Hebrew language, we can see how screwed up the Greek is, because all they did was take whatever they were copying from and go Greek, 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 bring it down. So then we can go backwards, Hebrew, 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 and then read it and go, oh, I had no idea. So simple, so clear. Fortunately, that's the only way they used to do it. Oh, here's an example. When I talked earlier about something that is really emphasized but is basically irrelevant, how many tenses are there in Greek?
5.
5, 6?
Yeah, 5 or 6.
So, now you don't get to answer this question because you studied Greek, but just based on sitting in pews and listening to pastors say, now let's look at the Greek. Now this word is blah, blah, blah in such and such a tense. What tense is that? What tense do you know?
Past tense.
Yeah.
Well,
I think I'm missing your question.
Yeah, I don't know what your question is.
they'll usually say, and this in Greek is in the such and such tense.
I've never heard anyone say that.
Really? Well, I generally, typically you'll hear somebody say, this is in the aorist tense.
Oh.
Okay. And usually that's the only one you're going to remember, because that's the only one for some reason, they never bring up any other tense. And the reason for that is because almost all the words that they're looking up are in the aorist tense, and the reason for that is that it's the default tense. They automatically use it. It has nothing to do with anything. It's the automatic tense. If it's not obvious that whatever they're copying is in a certain tense that matches with Greek, then they'll use that tense. But if it's not obvious, then they just automatically go aorist. It's just a default. So you can't learn anything from that. Because when they go, and let's look at the Greek, and it's in this tense, and it's in this mood, and it's in this voice, and therefore that tells us that it's a one-time but ongoing occurrence that never ends until, all of that information is not really relevant.
It's irrelevant.
Because the original language didn't have any of those things. So unless it's the same, you can't say that means something. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it just sounds intellectual when it's not.
Well, and I'm not faulting anybody for it. I'm just
Right.
saying if you don't know that there's a default tense, then you're going to make a big deal out of it. Now, it could match. I mean, it could be right. Whatever you're saying might be right, but you can't automatically say because it's this tense, which doesn't exist in this other language, that's it. Hebrew only has 2 tenses, past and future. Nothing happens now. Nothing can happening. It either happened or it will happen. Now, in Hebrew, if you're gonna use you talk about now, you talk about then, and it's called the proverbial future. So, take Benjamin Franklin. He'll say, "Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise." Makes now,
Yes.
right? But if you were going to say that in Hebrew, you'd have to say, early to bed, early to rise will make a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. But not some when. No. It's just the idea, if these are the things you do to get this result. This will make this happen. Now,